Yeah, how are you doing for time, Bob?
I have all the time in the world if you want to keep
Okay,
going.
great. Well, I mean, we should wrap up soon, but there's just I think we should definitely mention the tie and then the money, the ransom money found at Tina Bar in close to
Yes.
the yeah. So first of all, the tie.
Okay, first of all, the tie. Well, as the record shows, four FBI, four FBI agents boarded the airplane in Reno, Nevada, probably somewhere between 11 o'clock and midnight on the night of the hijacking. And on the seat or the next seat to where the hijacker had been sitting, they found a cheap black tie, um, which they retained as evidence. Previously, several witnesses had said that the hijacker had been wearing a black tie. So we can assume it's the same tie. Okay, it's the tie the hijacker was wearing. We don't have to debate that. Well, the tie proved to be what's called something like a snap-fast tie, a clip-on tie, sold by J.C. Penney's for $1.50 and had been on the market for a few years. In other words, a completely common tie, a tie that you could buy in any J.C. Penney's. I would say that the most important thing we need to retain about the tie is that in 2001, so we're talking, 20 years, 30 years after the hijacking, for the first time, the FBI did DNA tests on the tie. Now, I think DNA tests at that time were relatively new for the FBI. I believe they had only started to come into forensic use in the 80s in the UK and eventually had come in the USA. So it's perhaps not surprising that it was not until 2001 that they did the tests. However, the reservation we have to make is that we have no real idea of the chain of custody of the tie between 1971 and 2001. We simply do not know in what conditions it has been kept, whether sterile, whether isolated, whether persons had touched it, taken it out, moved it from place to place, contaminated it. We simply don't know. The chain of custody does not exist. Okay. But what the DNA tests showed was that the tie had several donors of DNA on it. The DNA donors were male, and there was more than one. The FBI did not say 2 or 3 or more, but they said more than one. There was more than one DNA donor on the tie. Therefore, whatever analysis we did of the tie could not necessarily tell us anything about the prior life of the hijacker. It might, but it could also tell us the prior life story of another person than the hijacker. I think that was for the overriding reason why the FBI did not take that any further. They did not see any point in pursuing the DNA of a person that could not be determined to be the hijacker. They also said, it's in the findings, that the DNA that they found was degraded, it was incomplete, it was not a complete DNA profile, and therefore, and this is what they wrote, the DNA could not be used to identify any person. In other words, even if a person was found with matching DNA in those parts of the profile that were capable of being matched, they could not conclude that that made the person the hijacker. And therefore, I think they knew that any such identification would never stand up in court. So from multiple DNA donors and a partial profile, I think that was the end of the line for them. And for me also, although I did write a chapter on the tie, because I acknowledge the work that other persons have done, other researchers have done on particles on the tie, microscopic particles, and using electron microscopy, I cannot personally buy into the assumption that anything found on the tie tells us about the hijacker. Therefore, with due respect to those researchers, I did not think that the tie was going to lead us anywhere.
And what about the ransom money? What was the significance of the discovery of the dollar bills at Tina Bar?
Well, there is a very that's a very significant finding. I mean, firstly, the money was indisputably part of the ransom money. The numbers matched. Every one of the identical numbers matched. Therefore, this money had been in the hijacker's possession on Flight 305 at some time on November 24th, 1971. That's indisputable. We now find some of that money on the bank of the Columbia River. So it's indisputable that that money became separated from the hijacker at some point. Now, the fact that it's on the bank of the Columbia obviously allows narratives to run wild. And they did, and they have, and they do. I, as a writer, preferred to, as I said in my book, I preferred to be constrained by Occam's razor, which I guess you know. That's to say that the simplest hypothesis is preferable to the more complex. So I did not want to take on board any hypotheses whereby human agency or animal agency or any intentional agency, whether the hijacker or any other person, is involved in the arrival of the money at Tina Bar. For me, that's a complex hypothesis. It necessitates complex assumptions. It's at variance with Occam's razor. It's the same reason why if you see a light in the sky, you don't have to posit an alien civilization. There are simpler explanations. So I felt the simplest explanation was that the money arrived at Tina Bar by the natural action of the Columbia River. And if that was so, again by Occam's razor, it had to arrive by a downstream flow and not by an upstream flow. Therefore, it had to have reached there from a point upstream of Tina Bar, and there's nothing that constrains us as to how far upstream it has to be. And now we can come back to the flight path where we look at the places where Flight 305 crosses a water body that leads downstream to Tina Bar. Okay, Joe, I have to pause for a second because I think I'm getting a message.
No problem.
Okay, we have an appointment at 4 p.m. and it's now 2. Okay, I guess we certainly have another half an hour.
Yes.
Okay. My wife is saying we have another half an hour, I suppose.
Okay,
that-
yeah, that's great. Well, I mean, honestly, I think after this, after we stop talking about the money, then it's really only if you think there's anything else worth touching on.
Yes, okay. Well, she's
So,
telling me that we have to be off at probably not later than 3. So,
no problem.
yeah, I'm sure we've got time. So,
Yes.
to pursue my train of thought, if you go upstream from Tina Bar, first of all, you've got the Columbia River itself. And then your most important major tributary is the Willamette, which runs into the Columbia at Portland. And then going upstream from the Willamette, you have several tributaries of the Willamette, which I guess it's fair to say become less and less likely as you go further south, but one would not necessarily rule them out. From the Willamette, you've got rivers like the Molalla, the Pudding, the North Santiam, the South Santiam. And you also have a very interesting lake called Lake Oswego, which drains into the Willamette. Now, Victor 23, and by my assumption, the flight path of Flight 305 crossed the Columbia River once and once only, at a point a little bit, about a mile to the east of the interstate bridge. This is an opportunity for the money, with or without the hijacker, to arrive in the Columbia, from where it can make its way to Tina Bar. Okay, the next crossing of that river system is approximately 2 minutes later, when Flight 305 runs very nearly parallel with the Willamette, which is the old center of Portland. Portland was originally founded on the banks of the Willamette, and the Willamette runs through Old Town Portland, running almost there in a north-south direction. So Flight 305 is running very nearly parallel with the Willamette, and you have a window of several minutes whereby the money can arrive in the Willamette, make its way downstream to the Columbia, join the Columbia, and make its way to Tina Bar. After the Willamette, you've got Lake Oswego. Flight 305 flew very nearly overhead Lake Oswego, which is a stagnant hyper-eutrophic lake. It's a very upscale lake. It's surrounded entirely by private property, by rich people, and the lake is reserved for them. That lake is full of algae. That lake is typically green with algae. It's full of diatoms. You can maybe see where I'm going. If the water arrived in Lake, if the money, any part of the money arrived in Lake Oswego, it has a great opportunity to pick up diatoms from this very, very algae-rich lake, and eventually find its way through a sluice, which is called Oswego Creek, into the Willamette. And Lake Oswego gets drained once every few years. They drain Lake Oswego down almost to its bed, and the water goes out into Oswego Creek and into the Willamette. So that's another way for money to get into the Willamette, into the Columbia, and down to Tina Bar. After that, I would say there's some more possibilities, but to arrive in the Willamette Columbia system, but by this time, the probabilities are getting lower, so I don't want to dwell too much on them. All I'm saying, and as I wrote in the book, there are other scenarios whereby money can reach Tina Bar and it doesn't involve any human